Ah, das ist die Freundin von Peter Kremski. Das ist die kenne ich doch, die ist aus Köln. Jetzt, wo ich es von hier sehe.
Buongiorno.
Stick muss fotografieren.
Buongiorno, buongiorno e benvenute e benvenuti a questa tavola rotonda dedicata alla retrospettiva Douglas Sirk. Prima di tutto volevo ringraziare in maniera, spero, non formale, l'enorme lavoro dei due curatori, Roberto Turigliatto e Bernard Eisenschitz, che hanno messo a disposizione tutte le loro energie, tutto quel che sanno del cinema, che è davvero tanto, per creare questo momento importantissimo di riflessione e di ricognizione sul cinema di Douglas Sirk. Voglio ringraziare Tis Brunner, che sta seduto qui in prima fila, che da moltissimo tempo che è un cavaliere della causa di Douglas Sirk, che ha tenuto accesa la fiamma di Sirk anche nei tempi in cui Sirk non era un nome sulle mappe di navigazione dei cinefili, perché se oggi siamo qui è grazie al lavoro di persone come Tis e Roberto, Bernard e le persone che sono intorno a questo tavolo, di fronte al quale mi inchino, perché grazie a voi che avete sempre custodito e difeso il valore e l'importanza di questo cineasta, che oggi siamo qui per celebrare quella che è l'arte del cinema, quella che oggi ancora una volta emerge come la dimensione sfaccettata, complessa, popolare di un regista unico. E in qualche modo questa giornata, questa tavola rotonda oggi è come la fabbricazione di un grande film degli studios una volta, i talenti delle singole persone che concorrono a creare un'opera unica e indimenticabile. Per me questa retrospettiva è un'opera ed è grazie a tutte e tutti voi che questa cosa è stata resa possibile. E poi infine una parola non formale di ringraziamento al pubblico, perché è solo in questo modo che il cinema può diventare una cosa di trasmissione, di passaggio, e il cinema stesso può diventare e continuare ad essere un passeur. Dunque con enorme commozione e gratitudine che ho l'onore di dare avvio ai lavori di questa tavola rotonda. Thank you, merci, grazie, herzlichen Dank.
Molte grazie, Giona. Parlerò in italiano. It's possible to speak in Italian, English or French, and there is always the translation in the three languages. So you can use this for translation. Laura Malvi ha evocato nel suo intervento qualche giorno fa, durante una presentazione bellissima tra l'altro, al Cinema Rex, la retrospettiva di Edimburgo del 1971 o 72, forse sbaglio, che è stata la prima retrospettiva dedicata a Douglas Sirk. Quindi erano passati 12 anni dalla realizzazione da parte di Douglas Sirk del suo ultimo film hollywoodiano, Imitation of Life. L'anno prima era stato pubblicato il grande libro Sirk on Sirk, di cui abbiamo l'onore di avere qui l'autore, John Halliday, e negli stessi anni, credo nel febbraio del 1971, Rainer Werner Fassbinder aveva pubblicato il suo famoso saggio su Sirk. In realtà Fassbinder aveva visto solo 6 film, credo, e su quelli aveva concentrato la sua attenzione. Questo saggio è stato tradotto, tra l'altro, proprio nel catalogo che aveva accompagnato il Festival di Edimburgo, e poi fu tradotto in moltissime lingue e contribuì moltissimo alla scoperta di Douglas Sirk. Era un periodo in cui Fassbinder era uno dei registi più importanti, quindi il fatto che lui avesse una venerazione per questo maestro hollywoodiano, che era stato sempre sottovalutato o non considerato, è stato sicuramente una spinta molto forte, soprattutto nella comunità internazionale dei cinefili. E qualche anno dopo Locarno fece una retrospettiva di Douglas Sirk nel 1978, se non sbaglio, che alla presenza del regista, che come sapete viveva non lontano da qui, fu una retrospettiva anche quella molto importante e che segnò la definitiva consacrazione di Sirk a livello internazionale. Quindi gli anni 70 sono stati gli anni della grande scoperta di Douglas Sirk. Prima c'erano stati solo qualche articolo anche importante, come quello spesso citato di Jean-Luc Godard, peraltro bellissimo, ma è in questo decennio che si è stabilito definitivamente la grandezza di Sirk. Allora la domanda che ci siamo fatti è: perché ritornare su Douglas Sirk da parte del Festival di Locarno? Perché questa è effettivamente la prima volta che il Festival ritorna su un autore su cui aveva già fatto una retrospettiva, anche se una retrospettiva con meno film sicuramente di quella che facciamo adesso, mi pare fossero 15 film circa. Ebbene, la risposta che ci siamo dati concerne soprattutto 3 punti. Primo, il fatto che c'è stata la possibilità di lavorare per la prima volta sull'archivio di Douglas Sirk e di sua moglie Halliday, che è stato depositato da Tis Brunner alla Cinémathèque Suisse. Ed è grazie a questo lavoro che è stato potuto fare, il Bernard ha cominciato a lavorare su questo archivio. E credo che i risultati si possano vedere, perché il libro mi pare che sia stato universalmente apprezzato moltissimo. La seconda cosa è che ci siamo resi conto che Sirk era un po' stato dimenticato nei decenni successivi, e mi sono reso conto, per esempio, che gran parte dei giovani, anche molto bravi, che si occupano di cinema in Italia, ma credo che valga anche per altri paesi, quasi non lo conoscevano, il che mi ha veramente lasciato stupefatto, perché per la mia generazione Sirk era un maestro consacrato che amavamo moltissimo. La terza e ultima considerazione è stato il fatto che anche tra quelli che continuavano a tenere vivo l'interesse per Sirk, in realtà si continuava a parlare di questi 5-6 film che sono sicuramente l'apice dell'arte di Douglas Sirk degli ultimi anni dell'Universal e il melodramma, e quasi tutti gli altri film quasi o non erano visti o non erano più stati considerati. Quindi secondo noi c'era l'esigenza di fare una retrospettiva completa, che è stato difficile realizzare, e in effetti lo dirò per quelli che ancora non se ne sono accorti, ma alcuni l'hanno notato: manca un film che è Weekend with Father, perché la copia dell'Universal è andata distrutta qualche anno fa e non c'era per il momento la possibilità o l'interesse di stampare una nuova copia. Comunque penso che questa retrospettiva ha questo scopo di rivelare l'opera di Sirk in tutti i suoi periodi, che sono diversi, in tutta la sua filmografia, che comprende film anche molto sfaccettati, diversi, non sono solo melodrammi. Sirk non è solo il maestro del melodramma, lo è, ma è anche di più. E penso che da questa retrospettiva, spero, ci auguriamo, possa nascere una nuova conoscenza più in qualche modo documentata. Per esempio per me è stato molto importante leggere il libro di Bernard, perché anche soltanto dal punto di vista biografico e di come sono state realizzate le opere apporta veramente degli elementi nuovi di cui non solo io non eravamo a conoscenza. Ecco, il libro è questo. Accanto a me c'è l'editore, Gaël Techer, che ringraziamo, lo potete trovare nella boutique del festival. Io concludo e darei la parola a Bernard, che può magari presentare gli ospiti.
Merci beaucoup, Roberto. You took the words out of my mouth, so there's very little I can add except introducing our guests. John Halliday, as Roberto has said, je ne sais pas pourquoi je parle anglais. John Halliday, as Roberto has said, is the author of the essential Sirk on Sirk book, and it's 2 editions. The first one published when Sirk was still alive, and the second one, the definitive one, the complete one, which is as Sirk had wished it to be. That is, the complete thing to be published after his death. So I will not say any more because he will there. Miguel Marias is a Spanish film historian who has written and coordinated many books, many programs. He's been the director of the Filmoteca Española, has written many books about many authors, among which American author of the so-called classical era. He has written about Douglas Sirk, of course, and he's an indispensable part in the knowledge of American classic cinema. Andreas Stuhlmann, as I said yesterday, has written a book about Sirk for a Hamburg publisher. The book, I think, is not known well enough because it is the first book which bases its first part, at least, on unpublished research in German archives about Sirk's biography in Sirk's first years. It is, to me, a remarkable work, and it deserves to be better known. And Martina Muller is a German essayist, film historian. She has made film essays about film history. She has published a book about Lola Montes by Max Ophüls' Lola Montes. And more recently, in the last year, she has made 3 radio programs, 3 multi-part radio programs. The first one about Douglas Sirk, the other one about Max Ophüls. Now, on my right, Andrea Inzerillo, among other things, has just published the Italian edition of Sirk on Sirk. Gaël Techer is my worshipped publisher, without whom, as the saying goes, etc., etc. And it's been a pleasure working with him because not only is he a publisher, but we also have spent several weeks working on the iconography. And we went to Lausanne together to start work on the iconography, and then we finished in the office working long hours on picking frame grabs and choosing among the stuff that I had seen in Lausanne, etc., etc. So it's been a very happy collaboration. And I think we will start by a very informal introduction by each of the participants. And so we might as well start on my left with John Halliday, who was, after all, the pioneer. So, John.
Thank you very much, Bernard. I want to just say a few words at the beginning about how the book of interviews with Douglas Sirk came about, and I apologize to anybody who was at the screening of All That Heaven Allows yesterday, because I'm going to have to repeat myself a little bit. But anyway, it's the first film by Douglas Sirk I saw was in a lovely outdoor cinema in Dubrovnik, in what was then Yugoslavia, which was The Tarnished Angels. And I loved the film, and I thought the person who's made this film must be an extremely interesting and sensitive and extraordinary person, in fact, I immediately felt. So when I went back to my university, Oxford, a month or two later, I had a great friend there, a Belgian called Patrick Beauchot, who has since become a very good actor, and who was a great fan of Sirk. And he fired me up to do something. He said, you know, if you love the film, you know, nobody's written much about Sirk, he's underestimated. And so we had a good conversation. And then I had a friend, Peter Wallen, some of you may know, a very great film critic who died recently, was working at the British Film Institute, and they had a new series of books called Cinema One, and he asked me if I would like to do a book on a director for the series. So I suggested Douglas Sirk with enthusiasm and with the support of Peter, but the British Film Institute turned him down, to my great annoyance. And I then thought, well, I'm going to have to do something, because I'm not going to let this chance go away. So I thought, well, there are several channels, but one would be to do an interview book with another director to convince them that I can do a good job at this, and so on. So I thought I'd lived in Italy for several years, and I wanted to go back. I then spoke good Italian. And I thought, well, there's one guy around who, A, is not that well known in the English-speaking world, but B, is extremely fluent. I'm sure that if I go and ask him questions, he'll answer me, and I won't have to, you know, I won't have to think too much. I mean, he's somebody, which was Pasolini. So I went off to see Pasolini, did a book of interviews with him, which I think came out pretty well. He was a very good interviewee. He was very, very articulate and very fluent, and I think the book came out, and that was in some ways much easier, because Douglas Sirk didn't want me to tape the interview, because actually after the British Film Institute turned it down, the American Film Institute came in. They had a program of oral histories, and they came in with an offer of money to do a long taped interview with Mr. Sirk. And then when he wouldn't tape the interview, he tried for a few minutes, and he just said, turn off that mic, you know, I don't like the sound, my English isn't good enough, I'm not sure I can remember enough about these, and so on. So you have to do it my way. So the whole book was done from notes that I scribbled down talking to him. And I was a bit apprehensive about it, but anyway, I went back to London. I wrote up the notes. I checked before I left. I said, do you want to see, I'd like you to, if you could, to look over what I've written to make sure it's right. So I sent them to him. And he said, this is very good. He only wanted to cut out a couple of things about people. He thought it's just better if don't say anything about that. He never wanted to speak ill of anybody. And he just added a few things, including actually quite a few bits about Tarnished Angels, which had been a great old project of his. And I must just add one thing, which is, when Renato mentioned the Edinburgh Film Festival, and that was a great event, and I was involved very much in bringing Douglas and Hilda over to Edinburgh. It was run by terrific people that Douglas and Hilda both fell in love with, and also for Douglas it was a chance to, he loved meeting people with bright and sparky minds, and also I think I felt watching him at Edinburgh that there was something very important from having lived under the Nazis, that was the thing of trust, and that he and Hilda both relaxed tremendously. There are some photographs of them at Edinburgh with enormous smiles on their faces, looking very, very happy, which was very, very nice for me and so on. Anyway, there's one other little thing about Tarnished Angels I couldn't resist putting in, which is after Edinburgh, I went to California and had to do some things to, amongst others, Edinburgh wanted me to try and see if Raoul Walsh, the great old American director, would go to Edinburgh for a retrospective. But I went to see him, I had a great time with him, but he said I'm too old and so on. But I also went to see the man who produced Tarnished Angels and Written on the Wind. It was a man called Al Zugsmith. And what I knew Al Zugsmith had been in business and been very successful. And he was a tremendously charming, he was a ball of fire who I saw could, make anything work and persuade anybody of nearly anything. But above all, he loved Douglas and Douglas's ideas and so on. But I discovered afterwards, which I didn't know at the time, to my great regret, that he'd become a millionaire in the 1930s running a publicity firm, PR firm, and amongst his, he was in Chicago, and amongst his clients was the biggest mobster in America called Al Capone, who some of you may know about, and so on. And so I think if I can put Al Zugsmith in a word, he's the man, if he could make Al Capone look good, he could sell anything. And anyway, he was a terrific guy, lots of fun, and he loved Douglas and did a great job. He got Douglas's the film he'd long wanted to make for so long, of Faulkner's Pylon, which is not a story I can see. When I read it, I couldn't see how anybody, but anyway, Douglas did it. And so anyway, I just had to get that in. So I found, the first thing was to find Douglas, because nobody knew where he was. People said he was dead and so on. And anyway, I finally found him through the Locarno telephone directory. And I rang him up. He was very, very nice on the phone, and he said, he said very nice. He was a very, very generous person, and he said things, I mean, I shouldn't repeat what he said, but anyway, he said, I'd love to meet you, and this is where I live, and can you get here next month, and we'll talk, and so on, fixed a time to meet, and so on. So I went off and to Lugano and spent about a month with him. I'm not all day, but all morning, from probably about 10 until 1. And then we had lunch together with Hilda and talked some more. And meanwhile, I was desperately scribbling down my notes. But anyway, when I got back to London, I found, and I started typing up the notes, I found that actually they were in pretty good shape. And above all, I wanted to try and recapture Douglas's very evocative way of speaking, which you can only partly do on paper. But I think I caught his way of presenting things, and also the things he wanted, about how he was presented with all sorts of films that were either the script wasn't good or very difficult and so on, how he could always find a way to turn a script into something that was able to portray his interests. And particularly, he was very fascinated with what he called split characters. And he also said something very interesting about, amongst many other things, but that he didn't like the term social criticism, which I'm afraid I used once about him, which I regret. But he said, what I really want, what I do is, I want to bring about social awareness. And he said, I want to just put the information out there, or the characters, or what they do, and then everybody who sees the film can make their own mind up. He said this about All That Heaven Allows, which is my favorite film of his, and strangely was the only film he couldn't remember making. And the next day when I came back to see him, he said, I talked to Hilda yesterday, and she said, yes, Douglas, you did make a film called All That Heaven Allows, and this is what it's about, and so on and so on. So anyway, that was all fine. Anyway, the book, I must wind up in a minute, but anyway, the book did pretty well, in spite of the British Film Institute's doubts about it. It did well. It did well in America, and I'm glad to say it got translated into 6 languages, the main languages in Europe, French, German, Spanish, and now Italian, and also, to my great pleasure, in Japan, and last of all, the one that made me really pleased was in China, because the rest of my books are banned in China, because I wrote a biography of Mao Zedong with my wife, who came from China, and that book is very seriously banned. And but the Sirk book but they did a beautiful edition. My wife said they did an excellent translation, and so I was very happy about that. Anyway, that's enough about my stuff, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Bon, now I'll ask the other participants very informally to introduce themselves in the same way in 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll go into a discussion if it's possible. And so we will start with Miguel Marias.
Well, hello. I've been already introduced by you very shortly in a way that is fitting. I must say I loved several Douglas Sirk films without knowing his name, and even before knowing that films had directors. I had already seen Sign of the Pagan. I had already seen, because I loved airplanes, Battle Hymn. I had already seen Mystery Submarine. So there were several films. And then when I became a cinephile and bought my first film reviews, I saw the name of Douglas Sirk and searched in dictionaries who was Douglas Sirk. In some dictionaries he did not appear, and in others he was badly treated. But I saw a list of his films, and I had seen already several, and curiously I like more or less all of them. So I was very interested and began to watch out for the films that I had not seen by him when they were screened in some far-off cinema in Madrid, dubbed into Spanish, and sometimes with censorship cuts. That was the element in which I became a cinephile, nevertheless. Then one day I went to a faraway cinema and watched a very long picture called A Time to Love and A Time to Die, and I was completely flabbergasted, completely moved and completely astonished. I had never seen a movie about the Second World War, which for me was so complex and so rich, especially for an American movie about the Second World War. Of course, after that, I bought the book by Remarque. This is an interesting thing. I've tried to search for the books in which his films were based, and I discovered one thing. Sirk was directly or through several people in the studios a transformer of original material. He always changed something, and he linked something, and he made characters more complex, and he made especially what he told them. I didn't know he did, but when I read John Halliday's interviews with him, the split characters. And I think it's a bit of the key for his films, for me. That his films are also split films in a certain sense, because they have the double possibility of moving directly the audience, and also you see that he doesn't completely believe what he is telling that could happen. It remembers me something that happens to people in desperate situations, that they pray even if they don't know to whom are they praying, even if they are disbelievers, but in stressful situations they believe that kind of wishful thinking. And I discovered that many of his films were about wishful thinking. So I found that his movies were not only very moving melodramas, sometimes really very difficult to stop what Coleridge said, stop the credibility of one, but that they admitted that. So they were knowing that people probably would not believe that could happen, but would understand that the characters would like that to happen. So I try to see every one of his films. I think I have already seen, thanks to this retrospective, which included the first shorts made in Germany. I think I now have seen all his movies. I don't know if there is somewhere a bit of a film by another director that he intervened. It happened that a lot with American directors who were contracted in a study.
Thank you. Thank you, Andreas Stuhlmann.
Mille grazie, Roberto. Thank you, and merci beaucoup, Bernard. One little addition to Bernard, to what you said about my book, or maybe two. One is I'm very jealous of your publisher, because my publisher had his pockets were sewn shut when I asked him about rights for images, and he said no, we have to do with little as possible. And when I look at your book, that's the beauty of it. And the other thing I wanted to add is that it's not only the German archives, it's mostly, and the book would have been impossible without it, it's the material at the Cinémathèque Suisse. And again, I have to thank thesis for making that possible, that I had the chance to go and see the material there at an early stage when some of it wasn't even accessible yet. I have my own story how I got to Douglas Sirk, but it's much more boring than you two. So I thought I prepared 5 theses for the future, because we have 3 generations of critics and researchers here at this table. That is not that round, but I prefer a long table outside to a round table inside, so I'm not complaining. And we need to make sure that the next generation appreciates Sirk's films maybe in a similar way as we do. So I have maybe 5 theses of things we have to maybe pass on to the next generation. The first thesis is it just me, or is it cutting out in and out? Okay, good. My hearing is that it cuts in and out, so I was just checking. The first thesis is that we actually do have to eliminate the biographical mythology that Sirk himself spread and taught about his life. And there is no critique of your work at all, John, but of course, if that's the method of conveying your own life story to somebody, that's the perfect way for a storyteller to make sure that your own mythology gets passed on to the to readers, right? There's no tape, there's no evidence, there's nothing except notes, and then you can hope you conveyed the way you want your story told to the readers. there are many, many instances, starting with the fake birth date of 1900, which we've known for decades now wasn't true. And of all the list, or the long list of things, I have just picked one, I wanted to talk about now, which is the famous distanciation principle that he always claimed had something to do with Brecht. And to my mind, there is nothing Brechtian about Sirk's work at all. The distanciation aspect is actually very common in the 1920s, the so-called cold aesthetic of the 1920s. And that is true for writers far from the left where Brecht is all the way to the intellectual right. So that is not even unique to Brecht at the moment. So this distanciation, yes, it's an extremely important element of Sirk's work. Yes, it's extremely important to how we receive those films, and of the. It's an extremely important element of how we receive the work, but the principle behind it is actually not towards Brecht. It has nothing to do with Brecht. The main thing where Brecht and Sirk obviously differ, and those of you who've seen some Sirk will immediately recognize that, is Brecht is a man with an enormous optimism in progress and future, and there's none of that in Sirk. For Sirk, history is a circular thing. History comes and goes in circles. He takes that from the Greek classics. His heroes are not Brecht, they're Euripides and Aeschylus, the Greek writers. And though he doesn't share in any of that optimism that Sirk is portraying. So again, one of the things we need to revise. Second, and more shortly, I also think, that, as Bernard has already hinted at, that much of his Sirk's aesthetic, especially in his melodramas, comes from him being a theater director. I think he learned everything that he brought to the movies already on the stage when he was, sometimes even his own producer of plays in the small theater in Chemnitz, and then later at a lesser degree in Bremen. That's where he learned much of his craft. So a lot of the things we admire about his lighting, the way he places characters together, all the little craft things that we see and are so great in his movies, down to the things we love, all the mirror reflection and all those images. That is all comes from work he did already in theater. And I don't think we give him credit enough for that, and I don't think we give enough credit for that as he influenced generations of other filmmakers. Most of all, and it's only also been mentioned, people like Fassbinder. That has another consequence if we start looking at that more critically, the whole question of auteurism. To me, Sirk, the question whether Sirk was an auteur in the French sense was never convincing. And and already in the many things he told John, and later also in other interviews, he made it very clear that there were always others heavily involved in the decision-making process. You mentioned L. Zucksmith. Of course, the producers are maybe even the more the driving force. Maybe they shape movies even more so than the directors do, at least in the studio system of Sirk's time. So I hope we get to do way more work on the interplay between directors and their producers. I think there's a lot to gain, especially for the classical Hollywood period, with regard to that connection. And if you're looking at today, maybe between, after Sirk and then the next generation Fassbinder, if we look at directors like Yorgos Lanthimos today, you can still see also maybe the theatrical tradition in filmmaking today. The third thesis, at the core of his melodramas, there is a deep humanity, and that to me is not a fatalism but a radical existentialism. And this radical existentialism is what actually deconstructs the characters. There's, that's also what unsettles us when we watch them. We know we're not on any firm ground watching these characters. They struggle. They almost fall off the cliff as we watch them do. And but to me, again, that is not something that is fatalistic. That is just, in the French sense, existentialist. I'll be rather brief with the last. And that's something I just encourage you to go and see. One of the reasons why I think it's so important to have the Sirk retrospective this year is because this year, as I've seen in the program for the festival, there's so many movies that are, on the one hand, classical genre films, and on the other hand, they're bending genre traditions and norms very dramatically. And Sirk is a very classic example of that too. Sirk is one of those people within the studio system who constantly went on to challenge, who would make genre films, but then in every little genre film, he would do something else. He would break the tradition. He would bend the rules, and he would push the genre. He pushed the envelope, as they say in English, to further and further to do something else with that genre. And then of course there is the there's the tradition of directors which I call the Sirkian circle. There's people like John Waters, Catherine Bigelow, Todd Haynes, Fassbinder, of course, all the way down to maybe Fatih Akin, and definitely Pedro Almodovar in the middle. And I would hope that we're doing everything to encourage a new generation, a young generation of filmmakers to pick up that mantle, to do it, to pick up this strange tradition of these terribly beautifully genre films and do something similar in a new generation. And there's very few I see in this generation doing this right now. One may be the French-Canadian Xavier Dolan. Many of you will be familiar with his work. And from Germany, maybe Farhad Sharias, a very young director from northern Germany, who made a beautiful film called Future 3. That's maybe the tradition that we should encourage. Thank you.
Thank you. You've already widely overrun the introduction. We're already deep in the discussion, and there's a lot of subjects for further discussion. But I was thinking we would just start with a very short introduction. Now we already have 5 theses, which is a lot. Hopefully, not everybody will have 5. I would just say that I've never seen any incompatibility between the idea that cinema is a collective work in which creative inputs can come from many people, and the idea that a film, as many other works, is in the end the work of an author. The idea of a collective being antagonistic to an author, or an author wiping out the work of a collective, to me, makes no sense. I think
Bernard never said that.
No, okay. Well, I'm just anticipating objections or further developments. Okay, so Martina, your turn.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Bernard. I don't have to introduce myself. You already did it. Thank you so much. Yesterday when I gave John my old Sirk on Sirk book, I mean, it's your book, but my old one, I saw how he started, the way he started. And he started with a quotation out of a dictionary, which is from 1966. It says, Douglas Sirk is the most neglected director in the whole of American cinema, which was true in 1966. So what do we have today? Today, I would say, Sirk has reached the heaven of philosophers. I read this sentence: who needs Hegel, Heidegger, or Derrida when you've got Douglas Sirk? I was I like the sentence very much. It was written by a New York University professor about a Douglas Sirk book published a year ago, which is called, I don't know if you have read it, Douglas Sirk, Filmmaker and Philosopher. So the author is Robert Pippin. I haven't read the book, but I do like this phrase and I have to repeat it. Who needs Hegel, Heidegger, or Derrida when you've got Douglas Sirk? Yesterday we had the great chance to see A Time to Love and A Time to Die on the screen. I mean, I've seen it a lot of times, but to see it on screen, this is getting, well, we were lucky yesterday to see it. And this time, and I saw different things in the film, and I did understand, I realized that without the terror of war, the characters, Elizabeth and Ernst, would not be a couple. So the paradox of this, I don't know if you have seen the film, but anyhow, it's not only about war. So the paradox of this love story is, it is the war that brought the two together. The war caused them to fall in love. What does that mean? As if love only exists because people are so desperate? This was my thinking yesterday. Maybe it's pretty banal, but it really took me yesterday to understand this. Well, the other film is Imitation of Life. I'm here the token woman, and I'm here the part of the melodrama girl. And Imitation of Life, you will see this film on the Piazza Grande, which is wonderful. And it's also a wonderful title. Sirk would have made the film for the title alone. And one could say Imitation of Life is a perfect headline, not only for Sirk's oeuvre, but maybe for the cinema in general. We see 4 women, black and white women, who are imitating what is called life, and what takes a lot of dissimulation and self-deception to do that. And I think this is still something we are doing today, as if life is only a fake. So for me, Douglas Sirk is timeless. Another thing, when I saw Imitation of Life the last time, it was at the time of Me Too. You might remember this. And you might remember a scene in Imitation of Life between Lana Turner and the agent Loomis. Do you? I'm not quite sure, but maybe you. And of course she has to sleep with producers. Whether at an agency on Broadway or in the offices of Hollywood studios, Sirk definitely looks at his own industry. Again, his films are amazingly topical. Again, something topical in his film. I saw it in the year, this Imitation of Life, when George Floyd was killed by white policemen in Minneapolis. Again, Sirk's films are timeless. And what is interesting in his film, he's getting the audience through emotions. His criticism is not exposed. He doesn't do it with a raised index finger. And I would say this is melodrama at its best. Whether you like it or not, some people either cry or either, how is it, puke? Puke? In both cases, melodrama provokes strong reactions. And Sirk challenges great feelings. He whips them up, and then he shows what suppresses these feelings. And I would say that goes beyond the private. It's not, there's more to the emotion on screen than just the individual unhappiness. And I would say a naive consumption of Sirk's films is perhaps possible, but not without consequences. And as his best melodramas, he has taken the so-called weepies, their innocence, their harmlessness. And what the world is suffering from is no less evident in Sirk's films than in Shakespeare's theater plays. Sirk saw his production conditions not far removed from the European tradition of popular theater. In a system of constraints, Shakespeare had been quite successful. Like Sirk, he had to work for the box office. This is the box office, the only thing which counts. Shakespeare had to bow to the wishes of his fellow producers, but his genius had slipped unharmed into immortality. And I would say this also applies to Douglas Sirk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. We'll go on my right. Tu veux reprendre la parole?
Oui, merci. Je crois que Andrea Inzerillo pourrait parler maintenant. Il est le responsable de l'édition italienne de livres de Sirk on Sirk, qui arrive a molti anni dopo, qui arrive beaucoup d'années après la première publication en Angleterre. Et Andrea a aussi le mérite qu'en Italie, il a recommencé un discours critique sur Sirk, qui était un peu absent depuis longtemps. Il faut dire aussi que dans les années 70, l'Italie aussi avait participé à cette vague internationale de la découverte de Sirk. Il y a vu, Sirk était venu 2 fois en Italie, à Milan, pour présenter les films de l'école de Munich. C'était Sergio Germani qui avait découvert à Munich ces 2 films pour les Italiens. Et il est venu à Rome pour une rétrospective organisée par Giovanni Spagnoletti. Et je voudrais aussi ajouter aux cinéastes qui ont aimé Douglas Sirk, qui ont été évoqués avant, Bernardo Bertolucci, qui a toujours dit qu'il aimait beaucoup Douglas Sirk.
Gianni Amelio, peut-être.
Et peut-être Gianni Amelio, mais ça, il faudrait lui demander en fait. Donc, Andrea, je te laisse la parole et tu pourrais nous raconter comment tu es arrivé à Sirk, parce que toi-même, tu m'avais dit que tu ne connaissais pas tellement ce cinéaste.
Grazie, io parlerò in italiano e sarò, credo, abbastanza breve. In effetti, per rispondere alla domanda se e a che cosa servono retrospettive come queste, servono intanto a fare un punto che grazie al libro di Bernard credo sarà definitivo su una coerenza dell'opera di Douglas Sirk, e servono a riprendere un discorso che è stato più volte interrotto nel corso della carriera di Sirk, della sua scoperta e della sua costante riscoperta. Io quello che ho visto appunto conoscendo i film di Sirk è stato un'onda costante, almeno per quanto riguarda la ricezione, e mi è sembrato che questo valesse oggi per l'Italia, a partire da un semplice fatto: non c'è un libro su Douglas Sirk in italiano, a parte il bellissimo Castoro di Alberto Castellano, che è uscito alla fine degli anni ’80, credo, e che è da lungo tempo non disponibile, e che molti dei film di Douglas Sirk non si trovano in DVD, non sono pubblicati, e io stesso ho dovuto faticare moltissimo a vedere tutti i film, e non li ho visti tutti, alcuni li abbiamo visti soltanto qui in questa retrospettiva, che è un segno di disattenzione che forse non riguarda soltanto Douglas Sirk, ma che mi è sembrato particolarmente significativo nei confronti di Douglas Sirk. E l'altra cosa che mi è sembrata molto interessante è stata scoprire che la storia di Douglas Sirk è una storia di passeur, è una storia di passaggi. Douglas Sirk non esisterebbe senza la mediazione di una serie di persone che sono state Serge Danet e Louis Courecky per l'intervista ai Cahiers du Cinéma pubblicata nel 67, che è stato John Halliday con questo libro straordinario, che è stato Fassbinder, che sono stati tanti altri nel corso degli anni. E allora, diciamo, io arrivo a Sirk vedendo occasionalmente alcuni dei film più famosi, dei melodrammi degli anni 50, ma soprattutto attraverso la scrittura, soprattutto attraverso i testi di Fassbinder, attraverso questo straordinario libro che è Sirk on Sirk, attraverso le interviste, il testo di Comolli, eccetera, eccetera. E questo, come dire, mi è sembrato abbastanza esemplificativo di che cosa rappresenta il cinema di Sirk al di là di se stesso, perché mi è sembrato di poter trovare nel cinema di Sirk non soltanto un interesse di per sé per i suoi film, ma un interesse sul meccanismo della cinefilia, sul meccanismo di ciò che è l'amore nei confronti del cinema. Cioè, io penso che il cinema di Sirk, a differenza di molti altri, abbia innescato in alcuni interlocutori la necessità di portarlo avanti, di proseguirlo per iscritto, ragionando, pensando, dialogando, organizzando retrospettive e occasioni di incontro. E questo mi è sembrato una cosa preziosa da salvaguardare e da riproporre. Io credo che ci fosse un po' di disattenzione in Italia, e con sommo stupore, io sono stato innanzitutto un lettore di questo libro, ho scoperto che non esisteva in italiano e ho dovuto un po' lottare, avendo poi la complicità straordinaria di Luca Formentone e del saggiatore, per pubblicarlo in italiano, ma non è evidente che un libro di questo tipo 50 anni dopo abbia un suo interesse o un mercato in Italia. Sirk diceva che ci sono alcune cose straordinarie che si trovano appunto guardando il cinema di Sirk e guardando quello che ha innescato. Godard diceva che appunto bisogna richiamarsi alla categoria della bellezza. Ieri abbiamo rivisto la scena di cui parla Godard e dice chi non è capace di vedere la grossa Mitchell di Douglas Sirk che si abbassa insieme al gesto di Liselott Pulver che si avvicina alla riva del Reno semplicemente non sa cos'è la bellezza o non ha visto niente nella vita. Allora il cinema di Sirk è un cinema capace di innescare la visione nello spettatore, di attivare quello che lui chiama il movimento del pensiero nello spettatore, e questo mi sembra una cosa importante e straordinaria. E c'è un'altra cosa che forse potrei dire per concludere, diciamo, questo primo giro, ed è una cosa che si trova nel libro, nel dizionario sul cinema americano di Tavernier e Coursaudon, 50 anni io ho un'edizione che è 50 anni di cinema americano, in cui loro parlano di Sirk a distanza, come dire, rileggono quello che avevano scritto in precedenza e dicono forse i nostri giudizi sul cinema di Sirk erano troppo cattivi, in realtà dobbiamo rivederli, però abbiamo l'impressione che l'intelligenza del regista nella conversazione con John Halliday rischi un po' di in qualche modo alterare, se non addirittura pervertire o influenzare la percezione dei suoi film, che mi sembra una cosa degna di riflessione, perché è come se si stabilisse che le immagini hanno un valore di per sé e che le parole e i pensieri possono modificarle e quindi in qualche modo ingannarci, mentre invece io sono convinto del contrario, cioè che le immagini di per sé non siano nulla e che invece è soltanto grazie alla profonda intelligenza dell'interpretazione e del pensiero che un cinema come quello di Sirk continui a vivere ancora oggi, e che quello che hanno fatto John Halliday e Douglas Sirk in questo libro è stato ribellarsi a una percezione completamente sbagliata di quella che era il suo cinema, e che quindi questa percezione merita in qualche modo di essere modificata e di essere proseguita, e ha una sua attualità e una sua importanza ancora oggi.
Grazie Andrea.
Bonjour. Je voudrais d'abord commencer par retourner le compliment et l'amitié à Bernard. Ça a été un plaisir incroyable de faire ce livre avec toi, à tel point que j'avais hâte tous les jours d'aller au bureau, c'est quand même rare, pour te retrouver. Voilà. Et après, moi je ne suis pas du tout spécialiste de Douglas Sirk. Je suis un enfant de la télévision française des années 80. Je crois qu'à un moment tu remercies Patrick Brion dans le livre. Moi je voudrais remercier Claude Schmoll, Eddie Mitchell, puisque le premier Sirk que j'ai vu c'était Écrit sur du vent. J'étais adolescent et c'était la dernière séance à l'époque. Et que, pour être tout à fait franc, je me suis profondément ennuyé devant Écrit sur du vent. Je pense que j'étais pas prêt du tout, hein. Aujourd'hui je m'ennuie plus du tout. Et Bernard, tu vas m'aider, j'ai un souvenir, en fait, ce qui m'a ramené à Sirk, c'est un écorché dans Libération. Je ne sais plus si c'est à l'occasion d'une rétrospective à la Cinémathèque française ou à l'occasion de la mort de Sirk, mais c'est Dané Escoretti, effectivement, qui avait fait un grand écorché sur une double page, et chaque zone qui était sur un écorché, c'est les muscles, mais là, chaque zone était un sentiment différent, tous les sentiments que Sirk pouvait provoquer au fur et à mesure. Et en voyant cet écorché, alors que je m'étais vraiment franchement détourné de Sirk, en voyant cet écorché, en lisant Godard, en lisant Fassbinder, enfin comme toi, Andrea, je suis revenu à Sirk, en commençant par le début, c'est-à-dire Imitation of Life, puis en remontant au fur et à mesure vers la fin.
Et ça a été, oui, c'est ça, c'est ce que. En fait, là, je ne peux que répéter ce que vous avez tous dit sur Douglas Sirk. C'est un cinéaste essentiel qui doit se transmettre de génération en génération, qui doit continuer à vivre et dont il faut continuer à voir des films. J'ai pas grand-chose d'autre à dire que c'est écorché.
Bon, comme on a parlé de la critique et des erreurs qui ont été faites pendant longtemps au sujet de Douglas Sirk, je voudrais seulement préciser que Douglas Sirk a eu un grand succès. Les films de Douglas Sirk, en général, surtout à partir d'une certaine époque, ont eu un grand succès au box-office. Et ça, c'est important. C'était des films diffusés par la télévision. Moi, je crois que Imitation of Life a été pendant longtemps le film plus vu dans la télévision italienne, jusqu'à au moins aux années 80, 90 peut-être. Et personnellement, j'ai vu le premier film de Douglas Sirk, Written on the Wind, noir et blanc à la télé. Et ce que je me souviens, c'est que toutes les critiques de télévision de l'époque disaient que les films étaient des films ridicules et très mauvais. Et par contre, ils avaient un succès énorme. Donc il y a aussi ce décalage, disons, pendant au moins une certaine période entre la perception des spectateurs et celle des critiques. Je trouve que ça, c'est quand même quelque chose d'intéressant au sujet de Douglas Sirk. Et aussi le fait que, comme Lionel Bayer l'a dit hier en salle, en fait, les cinéastes ont trouvé vraiment quelque chose d'important pour eux dans ce film.
Oui, alors ce décalage entre le succès et la critique est un phénomène courant pour les cinéastes qui ont travaillé dans le système américain, mais c'est un phénomène très, très précis, important dans le cas de Douglas Sirk, parce qu'il a quand même fait ses premiers films en Allemagne au moment où Goebbels limitait puis interdisait la critique, souvenez-vous. Le décret de Goebbels interdisant la critique et réservant les commentaires à de simples descriptions, et qu'ensuite il est arrivé dans un contexte américain où la critique était réservée à très très peu la critique était également une entreprise plutôt publicitaire ou réservée aux films qui s'avançaient avec l'étiquette important, les films à grand thème, les films à grand budget, etc. Donc il a été, pendant toute sa carrière, il a été presque totalement ignoré par la critique des deux pays où il travaillait. Et pendant ce temps-là, il y avait quelques notes, pendant la fin de sa carrière américaine, il y a eu quelques notes et quelques critiques en France, mais c'était vraiment un tout début, c'est-à-dire les Rivette, Truffaut, finalement Godard bien sûr, de Montsablon, l'équipe des Cahiers, et quelques petites remarques dans positif permettaient de se dire que là, il faudrait aller chercher. Bon, alors je voudrais simplement dire aussi que quelqu'un a parlé, somebody said this was a definitive book, and I explained yesterday that in my opinion there is no such thing as a definitive comment on anything. I mean, especially in the case of cinema, which is such a young practice, such a young art, or such a young industry, even after a century. Especially in the case of an archive which has not been explored thoroughly. So I hope the book is not. I hope the book is not the definitive book. I hope it's going to be an incentive for more research, and I think Andreas is already on the way of going to do it. And hopefully other people will react not only to the archive but also to the films. You have different reactions with different times. In a changing world, you will not react to films in the same way, and what happens is legitimate. It's completely legitimate. If people giggle looking at some aspects of the melodramas, let them giggle. It's embarrassing for us because we love those films and we feel very deeply about them. But after all, it has to do with their own culture. Their culture is not our culture. They've been born with images on television everywhere, whereas for us those films were rarities. It was, you know, it was a great chance when we had the chance of seeing a film that we hadn't seen by a director. It was something exceptional. It was really a feast. And so the situation is changing, and the films are changing. The films are changing with them, and I think some of Sirk's preoccupations, some of the things that come true when looking at his films all over again, are permanent, are still there. For instance, I've been struck by looking at those 40. By looking at those 40 films, I've been struck by his interest in a few films, but still, it is it's something that to me matters very much with his film. His interest for the what we call in French the marginaux, and what in German is the Außenseiter. No, there's a book by Hans Meyer about Außenseiter, homosexual women, rebels, etc. It's a fascinating, it's a great book, I think. And if you look at Rock Hudson in All That Heaven Allows, if you look at especially at the character of Sarah Jane, Susan Conner in Imitation of Life, you see that those people are exactly that. If you look at the flyers in Tarnished Angel, they are Außenseiter. They have chosen to be so, or it's their fate. It's not their fate, but it's their way of life to be so, and it hasn't been. And it may be interesting to concentrate on that. And there's in the fact of looking at those people, Außenseiter, I see something else in Sirk, which is his ability to look. I think we discussed this with Stis the first time we met. His ability to look at the other man or the other woman's, now we should say, a point of view, of putting himself in the other's shoes, as we say in colloquial English. I'm extremely interested in the fact that in three of his films, in three of his American films, Germans are in the center of the film. In his very first Universal film, Mystery Submarine, which I'm happy to say that Miguel Marias appreciates as much as I do, because Sirk did not at all. But Mystery Submarine is the story of a German woman who has become an American and is therefore liable to capital punishment for high treason. And she goes looking for her husband on a submarine, on a pirate submarine, driven by Nazi German after the end of the war. So the situation is we are with an American woman trying to pass, a German American woman trying to pass as a German to be an American all over again. And the film is not completely successful, but with a great actress, it is quite fascinating. And then you have this second film, which is a film I don't like, but which is an extremely complex film for me, which is Battle Hymn, where you see an American, second generation American, but born German, bombing a school with German children. And I'm not going to tell the story of the film, but the film is extremely strange and contradictory and paradoxical, and he becomes a. Thank you. So anyway, I'm not going to tell the story, but we have a man who kills and who becomes a priest, and who who becomes a military all over again, to go to another war, and to this time in the intent of saving children, which means that in the process more children will be killed. So this is an incredible story, all the more since it's since it's a real life story with a real life character as a technical advisor on the film. So it's unending. And then we have, of course, the last, this, to me, this masterpiece, which we've seen yesterday, Time to Love and Time to Die, in which the hero, this is an American film in which the hero is a German fighting against the Russian, the Soviet partisans. And we are asked to identify with German soldiers in a conquest war against the Russian and the Soviet. And if you look at the film, you can see that all the German soldiers are very characteristically American. You can see there is a very famous, an essential American comedian called Keenan Wynn, who has been in, I don't know, 50 musicals, who has been, who's the son of a very famous comedian. And so the hero, John Gavin, is anything but German. As a matter of fact, John Gavin was half Mexican, so he's a very dark guy. And John Mahoney is also. They're all very American soldiers, especially when you see them at rest. In war, they look like anybody else. They are just dark soldiers. They could be anything. I've been struck by seeing the film by Loznitsa and Babi Yar, because which is an archival film, and which you never know you see parades. So it's made of archives. So usually archives do not show fighting; they show parades, and you never know who is who, whether the German, whether the Soviet, etc. So you have this thing. They're just dark soldiers trying to keep alive. So you have this thing in these three films. We can identify, or maybe we are supposed not to identify, but to react to people who are on the other side. And I think that's extremely interesting. And the last thing I wanted to say to suggest that saying that everything has not been said, far from it, is Sirk's fascination with religion, which is not, so Sirk does not believe in, apparently Sirk did not believe in God, but believed in faith, and many of his films are touching on that subject. The one who does it most obviously and more deeply, I think, is the film we're going to see this afternoon, The First Legion. And religion for Sirk is an extremely strange and complex phenomenon, but which has to do not with God, but which has to do with the men living through religion, the men who religion helps living, etc., and getting into something very extremely complex, and which is not of one religion. Actually, he's interested in Catholic religion, where he was a Lutheran. And in this film, at the beginning, about 20 minutes into the film, someone comes with home movies from India. A priest comes with home movies from India and says, it's strange when you look at India, when you look at the holy man. The man is coming to show his travel films. When you look at the holy men in India, they're not so far of us Catholic priest. And I think that's a key phenomenon with Sirk, this kind of ability to complexify characters, and characters more than institutions, certainly, characters and stories. And that's it. I hope this will bring more discussion. Okay, this is supposed to be a springboard to more ideas.
Thank you very much. May I say a word about fate?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, when I wrote about the First Legion, I did not remember the passage where you spoke about Sirk's fascination with Buddhist religion, and I'm sorry I'd forgotten about it.
Okay, if I may just take up a couple of minutes just about fate. I remember I talked actually to Douglas quite a lot. We talked quite a lot about fate and hope and other related things, but they're just two very short stories. Once when we were talking about fate, I expressed some doubt about whether I believed in fate, and Douglas said to me, in a very affectionate but also quite strong voice, he said, "What, John?" He said, "You don't believe in fate?" You know, like that, and so on. And then I just want, if I may, because tomorrow Roman Huben is showing his documentary, which unfortunately I cannot be at, and I just want to say that he did an interview with me, and I thought he asked excellent questions, and I wish I could be there, but I can't. But I hope this is not spoiling things, but he's retitled his documentary from its original title to the following words: hope as in despair. Now, I can't pass up, I would have wanted to say this at this screening, but I can't be there. But this is something Douglas said to me when I was trying to spell out the address of a very good, very nice film critic or cinephile called Paul Williams, who Douglas had met at Edinburgh and had become great friends with, and Hilda and Douglas wanted to write to him and so on. Anyway, in Paul Williams' address, the name of the street was Stanhope Gardens, and Hilda's hearing wasn't too good, and also her knowledge of English wasn't as good as Douglas's. But so I said Stan as in Laurel and Hardy, and Hope, and I couldn't think what to say about Hope. I almost said Bob Hope, but I didn't. But I said Hope as in hope. And then I heard Douglas's voice coming in on the extension of the phone. I didn't know he was listening, and he said in this marvelous, sort of guttural, beautiful guttural voice, he said, "No," he said, "hope as in despair." And this is, I'm very glad Roman has taken this up. But strangely, if I could just add something, because of course I remember this remark and still do, you know, many times a week and so. But I just read the other day an interview with an American guy who'd been imprisoned in a horrible prison in Russia under terrible conditions and so on. And he did an interview with CNN. And the interviewer asked him about how he coped and so on. And one of the things he said was, he said, you have to give up on hope. He said, because hope destroys your emotional balance when you soon find out your hopes are not going to be achieved. And I thought, although Douglas didn't say that, I thought what he said may reflect what it was like, the conditions he lived in under Nazi Germany, where his first wife had become a Nazi, divorced him, got an injunction preventing Douglas ever seeing his son again, turned the son in not just into a Nazi, but a Nazi movie star. And Douglas was trying desperately to protect his second wife, Hilda, who was Jewish. And that I sort of felt these are, you know, feelings that somebody who has not lived through a dictatorship like the Nazis and so on, you cannot understand. You can know that they exist. You must know that they exist, although you cannot feel them yourself in the same way. But I have a feeling that somehow, when he said hope as in despair, that he must have had so many hopes that were crushed, and it must have been, years and years and years of constant anxiety and very, very never being able to achieve to rescue his son. I feel that maybe lay behind, after this America, that lay behind this remark, which at first I thought was him, you know, being with his very dark humor. But he was also very, very funny, which was good, very funny. Yeah, I think I put in the book his story about having lunch with Remarque while they were shooting Time to Love and A Time to Die, and Remarque said, he wanted to have lunch with Douglas, and Remarque, who wasn't good looking, Douglas said, but he was very attractive to women. And anyway, Douglas told the story with great relish, and they sat down, and Remarque said to me, to Douglas, he said, I'm in a terrible, terrible situation. He said, there are two women who are in love with me and both want to marry me. And Douglas said, oh my God, Eric, you know, what a terrible situation. And so on. And who are they? And so Eric Remarque said, well, one is Paulette Goddard and the other one is Marlene Dietrich. So Douglas said, oh my God, Eric, what a terrible, terrible situation, you know. I mean, my God. And so he said, what are you going to do? And so Remarque said, well, he said, Marlene Dietrich is a lovely woman and I love her very much. So he said, but Paulette is very good at the stock market. Yeah. So I think I'm going to go for Paulette. But he told this story so well, and he laughed himself a lot after. So it was very, he had a great, that was a thing maybe, Tis knew Douglas very well. And so on. I mean, he did have, along with, you know, there was sadness there and so on, but also tremendous zest for life as well, tremendous zest for life, and great humor, and also great gentleness too, great gentleness, yeah.
Thank you.
Anyway, I've gone on too long.
Thank you.
Non, il y a quelqu'un qui veut parler tout de suite sur ce que vous avez écouté jusqu'à présent. Peut-être vous avez des réactions. Miguel ou Andreas ou...
Sinon, je vais dire, I would like to add a word on the contradiction that Andreas Stuhlmann pointed out on the apparent contradiction between autobiography, Selbstdarstellung, self-description, personal testimony, and so-called scientific research. To me, it's a very productive contradiction to be able to have an author, an artist, whatever you want to call him, to have his personal, intimate view of his work, not necessarily an intimate view of his life, but of his life story, but of his work. And I think the research, my documentary research certainly has been extremely directly governed by Sirk's remarks on his filmmaking. Not only his remarks about emotions, his remark about his own emotions or life peripéties, life adventures, but I think everything he says in this book, maybe some dates are wrong, maybe some incidents are more or less rewritten by memory, as all memories are. All memories are rewritten. So, but when he speaks about his filmmaking, when he says, for instance, my camera has never betrayed me, etc., and these are extraordinary film lessons, extraordinary artistic lessons, and I think this is the best springboard for documentary research. If you don't know where to go, or if you know too well where to go, you should rely on this. The archive, the Sirk archive, this should be explained at length, but not here and not today, had very little about his own filmmaking. But what little there was helped, but would not have been enough if we did not have had John's book and, well, Sirk on Sirk, which is a much better title, I think, than Conversation avec Sirk, as it is in French. But so I think this is an extremely interesting contradiction, and to me a very productive one. And well, that's all I wanted to say for the moment. The rest can come in off the record conversation, let's say.
Okay.
Sì, diamo la parola alla sala.
Sì,
Dici tu.
non, nous avons des invités qui sont là et nous avons aussi bien entendu le public. Donc, si quelqu'un veut poser des... Voilà, Stig Björkman.
Thank you. It's been very interesting to hear all of you, and I just want to add something which, sorry, I don't think any of us can answer directly, and that's the comparison between theater and film with Douglas Sirk, because we know he started in theater and then came over to making movies, but we haven't been able to see his direction of the theater. And I can compare his double work, so to say, with others like Elia Kazan or Max Ophüls or, of course, Ingmar Bergman, where we in Sweden can be quite lucky because so many of his most interesting and important theater work has been filmed, and we can, through Swedish television, see it. And what I wanted to come to also is to compare the choices of plays, and later on also for Sirk, and the choices of films he is making. For instance, the same year as Bergman made Cries and Whispers, he directed a play by Mishima, La Marquise de Sade, on stage. And you can see, if you compare these two oeuvres, it's quite interesting. When he staged Strindberg's A Dream Play, he made Hour of the Wolf in the summer. So we are lucky we can make these kind of comparison between somebody who is engaged in both medium, and you can also, I think, see from Sirk's films, whatever it is, his direction of actors, and that he has this background of theater in the way he is leading his actors on the film stage. So, yeah, that was just a short comment.
Thank you.
No,
Thank you.
no, but you're very lucky because you have seen the films not as recorded on television. I've recently worked on Visconti's staging of Dommage qu'elle soit une putain in Paris, and I did not rely at all on the television recording. I relied on my 50-year-old memories, which were scarce, but still it was better than looking at a television recording. But in the case of Sirk, there's nothing, and I must say that's one of the great good discoveries of the archive. There are a lot of reviews, and I think Andreas and I agree on the fact that theater was essential in his formation, in his building up as a film director. Also as an aside, I would say it's interesting to see that Sirk is always, from one film to the other, is always inventing something more. So obviously, when he sprung from the stage to film, it was not only a change, but it was also some kind of a progress for him. And you see, when you see the film in chronological order, you will see that in every film he invents a little thing that he will use and transform in the next one, etc., etc. So I guess I've tried to retrace the history of stage, and obviously his choice of plays changes a lot from Bremen to Leipzig, and from what we know, his staging, which is already very, very assured when he starts in Bremen is obviously evolving towards the use, not towards the use of cinema, because that was there from the beginning, but towards the use of acting, using a lighting, especially lighting, decor, and of course actors, which is the thing that we cannot discuss about theater. We only have those. So I'm sorry, but I'm very happy to say we haven't added there are those two events, the translation of John's book by Andrea Inzerillo and the publication of Douglas Sirk by Gaël Teicher, but there's also a documentary film that you're going to see tomorrow, the Douglas Sirk, Hope as in Despair, by Roman Huben, who is here. And I must say we've worked in parallel, more or less. We met at when he was beginning his research, or when I had already started, I think, and we worked very closely, as closely as we could. We were not being in the same cities, but we exchanged information. He helped me a lot. I helped him a little. We discussed stuff, etc., and it was very good. And I was impressed by, well, I'm not going to say in which way I was impressed by his film. Let's say it was, to me, it was not a predictable film. You have a lot of documentaries about filmmakers, about heroes, about times, and most of them are extremely predictable. I will just say that this one, to me, is not predictable. Thank you.
May I add one?
Sorry.
No, can I add one?
Please.
May I add just one word? Sorry, which is the only time I did ask Douglas a question, which it provides just a tiny little, which is he had, I think it was in his film of Pillars of Society, I think he had this famous German actor, Stefan George.
Heinrich George.
Heinrich George. And who I thought was a bit stagey in the film. He was this very big man and so on. And so Douglas said, oh, well, he said he was a very big stage actor and he had his own ideas about, he said, but I had to scrape away all the staginess from him for the film, you know, yeah. I mean, that's the only remark I can remember him about related to what you said. But I think what Bernard says also about lighting, I mean, he knew a tremendous lot about technique. He had a fantastic ear for both music and people's voices. He has the voices in his films are extraordinary, I find. And then he also had this tremendous reservoir of knowledge about the structure of the great Greek plays, Spanish plays, Shakespeare and so on. So he could, when he was handed something by the studio, because half of the films are probably, well, the result of the studio saying, would you make this? And so he could always find a way to turn it to something that met his own interests, you know, and did so very successfully, in my opinion, yes. But it doesn't, it's a very, not a satisfactory answer, but the best I could do, yes.
There was a question about here and here, or whatever.
Emmanuel Déonat de Genève, merci beaucoup, un très grand merci pour cette exceptionnelle rétrospective, Bernard Eisenschitz et Roberto Trogliato, et pour ce superbe livre aussi, qu'on a vraiment la chance de pouvoir lire, et cette table ronde passionnante, et vos interventions. Ma question, j'ai deux questions. La première, c'est sur le film Mirage de la vie, portrait de Douglas Sirk de 1983, qu'on va pouvoir voir ici aussi grâce à la Cinémathèque suisse, Sirk à la fin de sa vie avec sa femme. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous donner quelques indications sur ce film ou comment est-ce qu'il a été tourné et qu'est-ce que vous pensez de son résultat? Est-ce que ça, c'est ma première question. Et ma seconde question, c'est sur ce concept de hope as in despair. John Halliday, vous avez développé cette idée, insisté sur le fait que Sirk avait un zest for life, humor and gentleness, et en même temps qu'il avait vécu des épreuves extrêmement douloureuses et que l'espoir n'est peut-être pas ce qui caractérise son œuvre ou sa prédisposition émotionnelle de base. Je voulais quand même vous demander, ces films, et indépendamment du fait qu'ils soient des années 40, 50, 60 ou 70, nous montrent, comme vous l'avez dit, des personnages qui se battent, qui font aussi preuve de beaucoup de courage face à des circonstances très difficiles. Est-ce que on peut parler quand même d'un cinéma engagé dans un certain sens? Bernard Eisenstadt, vous avez beaucoup insisté sur le fait qu'il s'intéressait aux marginaux, qui nous permettaient de nous identifier à des marginaux ou à des personnes qui ne sont pas favorisées par l'ordre social. Est-ce qu'il y a un engagement dans son œuvre, et si oui, quel type d'engagement? Merci beaucoup, encore.
Je réponds à la première question.
Oui, bien sûr.
Bon, je vais répondre à la première question. En fait, Mirage de la vie, c'est un film réalisé par le grand cinéaste suisse Daniel Schmidt. Il y a différents documentaires qui ont été réalisés sur lui, et d'entretien. Tout d'abord, on a la chance d'avoir ici une première mondiale d'un film sur Douglas Sirk, le film de Roman Huben dont a parlé Bernard. Et en fait, c'est la première fois, je crois, que dans une rétrospective, on peut présenter une première mondiale. Et ça a été une grande chance pour nous, parce que vous avez travaillé en même temps que nous, je crois, à peu près. Donc, on est arrivé au même endroit ensemble. Et on a pu réunir les deux recherches qu'on a faites. Donc, merci, Roman, pour être là. Et le film de Daniel Schmidt sera présenté par Renato Berta, qui a été le chef opérateur du film. Donc, certainement, il va nous raconter comment le film a été réalisé, comment ils ont rencontré Sirk. Ce film est réalisé dans la maison de Sirk. Et peut-être Tis en sait plus que moi. Je crois que c'est la dernière fois que Sirk a été filmé par quelqu'un, les dernières images. C'est un film de... Voilà. Et donc, je pense qu'on pourra parler de ça dans la salle avec Renato et Tis, évidemment. Et je suis très content de présenter ce film parce qu'en fait, c'est là aussi un film d'un grand cinéaste, à mon avis, sur d'autres grands cinéastes. Et juste quelques années avant la mort de Douglas Sirk. Et pour la deuxième question, je ne suis pas peut-être Bernard.
J'ai trop parlé.
C'est ça.
On en parlera.
On en parlera.
Mais je pense que
donc, le titre du film de Roman est celui-là. Donc, là aussi, on pourra reprendre la discussion. Je voulais encore m'excuser un peu avec Andreas parce que j'avais dit que nous avions été les premiers à accéder au... I'm sorry. Je voudrais m'excuser avec vous parce que j'avoue que je n'ai pas lu votre livre. Et j'ai dit qu'on était les premiers qu'on avait eu accès à l'archive, ce qui n'est pas du tout vrai parce que vous avez travaillé avec l'archive bien avant nous. Donc, c'était seulement une précision de ma part. Non, c'était...
I tell him.
Yeah, OK. Bon, il y a quelqu'un qui... Il y avait quelqu'un d'autre... Oui, voilà.
Thank you all very much. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much for this wonderful retrospective. I've been a huge admirer of Sirk's films for nearly 50 years. And ever since reading Sirk on Sirk, actually, there was a retrospective shortly after the Edinburgh retrospective in London, which I attended. But my question, what I wanted to just say is that perhaps it's been neglected. That for me, there's something very important visually in Douglas Sirk's films. And obviously, it's hard to separate a contribution of his great cameramen. Yeah. But I'm interested, perhaps John might be able to answer this best. To what extent was Douglas Sirk also a visual person, because I feel there's a strong visual component.
Yes.
So I wonder, we know he was a man of the theatre, but was he also interested in art and painting, for example?
Yes.
And then on just a personal question, which John might be able to answer, is I'm interested in the story of his loss of his sight, and how he managed, how he could cope with that. I mean, it's difficult for anybody, but how would a filmmaker, in particular, cope with that? And the man who made Magnificent Obsession as well.
Right. Okay. Well, let me take the first. Let me do them in order. So, well, first of all, the visual thing, which we see, had a fantastic eye, and he'd studied painting with Erwin Panofsky, and who was a very great, great critic. I shouldn't say critic, but a great man on painting. And I think, if I remember rightly, Douglas was planning to do a thesis on paintings in the churches in North Germany on the Baltic. And I don't know if ever he started, or if that's anywhere has turned up or anything. But he had a tremendous eye. I remember at the time I had a house in the country, a rather beautiful sort of Art Nouveau, with one of actually the best, what the English called international modern, but which was a kind of cross between Bauhaus and something else. Anyway, in a very beautiful place. And I remember Douglas coming down one day with his wife, and we were walking in the garden. It was on the side of a hill, with a beautiful view right down to the south coast. And I remember coming up the hill with Douglas and this beautiful white house and so on, and Douglas stopping and saying, he said, "God damn it, John, you've got nothing but great angles here, And he would often be commenting on things in that sort of way, His visual sense is very alive, and you can also see it. I mean, in things like the way he films people's faces. He's got an incredible ability to catch a person's personality. And also I think he was a real wizard at lighting, because some of the shot, for example, and this also relates to his use of sound. I mean, for example, in Magnificent Obsession, two of the most remarkable sequences are ones with no voice. One is when Jane Wyman is told that her husband is dead, and the second one is the shot in the inn in Switzerland, where she's walking towards the balcony, and we know she's thinking about committing suicide, but it's done just with lighting and music, and his ability also to frame her. And I mean, everything is perfect. I think everything is perfect. Both those scenes are amazing to me. Yeah. So he had a wonderful eye, no question about it. Yes. And I'm sorry, the second question was about his son. Yes, son. Yeah.
His sight, eyesight.
Oh, his eyesight. His eyesight. Yes. Sorry. Yes. Yes. Oh, yes. So after I first met him, he started losing the sight in one eye, which was, of course, very, very distressing. And I remember him describing, he was in a rest home in a clinic in the mountains in Austria, and he said he got up to switch on the light, and the light didn't come on, and he realized that he was blind, at least in one eye first, I think, and then the second eye. And he obviously suffered greatly from this, and he said at one point, almost, I mean, he said, it's ironic, I made this film about blindness, and now I'm going blind. And he was fairly blind towards the end. I remember one of the last times I saw him when when I arrived, he met me in the hall and he gave me a big hug, which he hadn't done before, and he said to Hilda, Hilda, John is looking really good. And I said to him, I don't know why I said this, but I said, oh, but Douglas, you can't see me. And he said, no, but I can feel you. It was very nice, yeah.
Il y a des questions ou peut-être quelqu'un de nos invités veut parler? Intanto, je voudrais bien remercier deux personnes qui sont là. Elena Diesbach, qui nous a aidés pour le film de l'école de Munich, qui est vraiment très important parce qu'on a pu restaurer les 3 films que Sirk a tournés à l'école et que vous avez vu hier. Et il y aura encore une projection, je pense, à la fin du festival samedi. Donc, les gens qui n'ont pas pu voir le film hier peuvent le récupérer. Et je veux également remercier Luciano Palumbo de Murnau Stiftung. Et en fait, Murnau Stiftung nous a aidé beaucoup, soit en nous donnant des copies, soit en nous donnant des informations. Et c'est grâce à vous, en fait, qu'on a pu projeter tous les 3 films les courts-métrages du début de l'œuvre de Sirk. En fait, on a pris aussi des copies à Bundesarchiv, mais ça a été une très bonne collaboration. Donc, je sais que Murnau Stiftung est en train de travailler ou a déjà travaillé sur tous les films allemands de Sirk, et vous êtes en train de restaurer tous les films. Merci. Je ne sais pas s'il y a quelqu'un qui veut... Bon, d'accord.
Non.
Bon, mais donc, comme on dit toujours, c'est pas... On termine la table ronde, mais la rétrospective continue cet après-midi. Et on présente Shockproof, on présente le film dont a parlé Bernard.
La Première Légion,
Première Légion, First Legion. Et je crois demain, il y a votre film, Romain. Mercredi, après-midi. Et puis il y aura aussi John Hayes qui va nous rejoindre pour présenter un film de Douglas Sirk et pour présenter son film Far From Heaven. Donc, nous sommes à peu près à moitié de notre chemin et je vous souhaite une bonne continuation. Et je ne sais pas, Tis, tu veux dire quelque chose? Merci, grazie.
Merci pour la collection sur Heinrich George. Pourquoi